Good morning and welcome to Whole Hog Politics, brought to you by The Hill and News Nation. My name is Bill Salmon, your host, and as usual, I'm joined by my old pal Chris Stirewalt, author of the Whole Hog Politics newsletter, a new edition of which just dropped this morning, Friday the 13th. A very busy news day. Chris, let's get right to it. Overnight, Israel, as you know, attacked Iran's nuclear facilities. One of the most remarkable things, in addition to that very fact, was watching the Trump administration basically say, "Hey, Iran, like that wasn't us, okay? That's Israel acting alone. So don't hit us. If you hit us, we're going to hit you back." My question to you is, will the U.S. become entangled in this conflict between Israel and Iran, or will we be able to stay out of it largely?
Well, the question for the Iranians now is, what else could you do? What are the other things that you could do? The Gulf states, the Sunni Arabs, are probably very happy with what the Israelis did, right? Killed the leader of their air force, a lot of their top military brass, and knocked out their nuclear program, or so that's what the Israelis say. And if that's all true, then of course the Saudis and the other Arab states that the president recently visited are all cool with that. So one of the things that comes clear here is that the October 7th attack and the new alliance, the depth of the alliance between the would-be Palestinians and Iran has pretty disastrous consequences for Iran, because if these are the actions that have set in motion this attack, who will stand with Iran, right? So it's a good question to say, will the United States become embroiled? But the question is, who would become embroiled on behalf of the Iranians? Because the idea of a sort of pan-Islamic coalition against Israel, which was true for much of Israel's existence, it's not there. So does Russia, which is busy doing other things, does Russia want to help Iran? Does China want to help Iran? It seems unlikely that they would want to. And if they don't, then we may have, if we're very lucky, we may have a situation where Iran has to look tough, offer some drone attacks, do some more things. But I don't think it's reasonable to expect that the Iranians are going to be sending an army across Syria. They don't have those forces, and they know probably what would happen if they did. So maybe that's in the light most favorable to the Israelis, and maybe the best case for the United States is that Iran doesn't have very many options and kind of has to eat it.
You know, it's interesting. You mentioned October 7th as perhaps the starting point of what we're witnessing now. I think others have interpreted it, especially on the Democratic side, as saying this started when Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. This is on Trump. Where is the truth on the origins of this?
Well, I mean, if
how far back do you want to go?
Right, we could really reel this one back, but look, we've talked a lot in American politics about what the consequences would be of how things have gone in the Ukraine war, and the United States pulling back, and can Europe step up, and what is this all going to do? The lesson for threatened smaller powers from the Ukraine war, we've talked a lot about, will this embolden China if Russia gets away with it? Will this embolden other bad actors if it gets away with it? But it occurred to me this morning, it most certainly must embolden those threatened smaller powers. Because if you take the lesson from Ukraine, the lesson is you better just go for it, right? You better just go for it. So if you're in Taiwan, you think, well, maybe I'd better just go for it. Maybe there are things that I should do that normally I wouldn't, out of concern of antagonizing the United States, that now I better just do. Because the arc here with Netanyahu seems to be the United States was trying to get back into a nuclear deal with Iran, working hard. Steve Witkoff working hard. We're going to do it. We're not going to allow enrichment. Maybe we'll allow a civilian nuclear program, but we want to get this Iran deal done. And as the clock is ticking on that, seems like Israel said, we better go. We better act now and do this. And as you said, the White House says, it wasn't us, Iran. We're still trying to make a deal. And then a few hours go by, and President Trump says, actually, we dig it. We like it. They used our stuff, and we'll actually help them if you do anything. So here we are. So Netanyahu felt like he was cornered, and he certainly is politically cornered at home. His government is splintering. Says, "Let's go," and lights up Iran and forces America's hand. And that's a very interesting dynamic to see play, where these countries that they're not satellites of the United States, but they're dependent on the United States for their continued existence, that they say, well, we better go off on our own hook here. Kind of don't listen to Trump too much. Do what we're going to do and hope that we can improve our situation and keep the United States constrained.
Does this effectively knock out the negotiations that we were in the midst of with Iran on a nuclear deal? Is that sort of now sidelined?
The regime in Tehran has a lot of domestic problems, and foreign conflict typically is good in terms of keeping authoritarian states in power. And I would suspect that internal pressure on the regime in Tehran will be lessened by this, not enhanced by this, and that it will give them a cause to stay in power, to keep strict rules in place and suppress resistance inside their own country. So I don't think peace would be good in a lot of ways, probably in the minds of the rulers in Tehran.
Let's move to domestic politics, Chris. Yesterday, Senator Alex Padilla of California, Democrat, tried to interrupt Homeland Security Director Kristi Noem at a press conference, and he was forcibly ejected from the room.
They cuffed him.
Pushed to the floor and handcuffed. Democrats saw this as an outrageous abuse of power and another piece of evidence in what they call the growing authoritarianism of Donald Trump's administration. Republicans said he was lunging at the secretary and it was unbecoming of a U.S. senator to act this way, interrupting her, and that Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, even said that Padilla perhaps should be censured. How do you see it, Chris?
Well, the useful word that everyone is looking for is and is the word that will solve the conundrum. Both things can be true, right? It can be true that Alex Padilla was pulling a stunt and trying to get attention and trying to be disruptive and not acting in an appropriate senatorial fashion, and that he was hoping for a confrontation. I doubt in his wildest dreams he could have hoped for a response from ICE like the one he got. Watching Kristi Noem come out and talk to reporters afterwards about the nice conversation that she had with Senator Padilla tells you they definitely overreached, because Kristi Noem wouldn't say something about a nice conversation with Alex Padilla unless she thought she was in pretty substantial trouble. So it's possible that Alex Padilla acted like a goofus and was trying to trigger a confrontation to exploit. And it's also true that right now, what's going on with ICE and with all of this stuff, it's getting very heady, right? It's getting very heady. We're talking about these raids, we're talking about riots, we're talking about all of this stuff. And as they flex their muscle more and more, faced with the resistance that they're facing, not just in Los Angeles, but around the country, you see the grip tightening, right? You see the knuckles whiten a little bit as the federal government. And by the way, speaking of triggering conflicts that you hope to exploit politically, I think that's a lot of what we see in what ICE has been doing. We read about what Stephen Miller, the president's chief advisor on immigration, told ICE officials and what they want. I think they want the conflict. I think they want the showdown because they want to demonstrate. Well, in my eighth digression, let me just say, when you hear the administration say out of one side of its mouth, we're going to start cracking down on employers and we are going to really, really, really go after it, which would be massively disruptive for the US economy. And then you hear the president say out of the other side of the administration's mouth, but we're going to do something for the farmers and we're going to do something for the hotel owners because we know that it will be bad if we do this. It feels like there's one track that's going forward, which is this ICE track, this hardcore, light them up, tear gas them, go hard, do whatever you have to do, shut down businesses, do whatever you need to do. And then that keeps running into the political reality of, while Americans like the idea of the immigration laws being strictly enforced, and they like all of that, we're getting into an uncomfortable space probably for a lot of voters.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the LA riots, and of course, we can't not talk about Governor Newsom and his showdown with Trump. As the week unfolded, it seemed to me, and I think in a lot of people who were observing from a political perspective, that these were good optics for Trump because, Newsom had to sort of take the side of the guy standing on the burning car waving the Mexican flag, and it just, it wasn't a good look. But then, it's starting to emerge that one good thing for Newsom politically is that he is sort of now seen as having solidified the position of the anti-Trump resistance leader as we head into 2028. So it's sort of a double-edged sword. This crisis has thrust him to the head of the pack of Democratic hopefuls, and I know we're early, but it's never too early.
Never too early.
At the Hill.
Never too early.
But on the other hand, the topic, the actual policy that he's opposing Trump on is kind of tricky. Will voters forget that and simply remember that he stood up to Trump?
So Gavin Newsom and I wrote back a correspondent who wrote in with a question pertaining to this. And Gavin Newsom had a 25-year career as sort of a sellout, squishy, corporate kind of Democrat, a very Clinton kind of Democrat. Mouth the pieties, but basically be a pro-business, pro-whatever kind of Democrat. A normie of the old variety. He served as Jerry Brown's lieutenant governor. And Jerry Brown, of course, famously was a very moderate governor of California. His response to the Schwarzenegger era, the Democrats' response was to get moderate. But then, under Trump, the Democratic Party in California radicalized. And it got real weird. And Gavin Newsom went along for the ride. And you saw the damage that it did to Kamala Harris, who had been the attorney general, who was also from San Francisco, following a similar track of Newsom. And it looked very obvious that after 2024, Newsom decided he was not going to get left out in that one. He was not going to end up like Harris, and repositioned himself on a host of issues, got back to a squishy center, talking about trans rights and woke language and all that stuff, forgetting, as politicians love to do, his violations of those same things he decried in the previous 6 years.
Latinx and so forth.
Exactly. This is the severely conservative Mitt Romney. People run for office and they say that new positions, who dis, and so that's the norm. But the problem for Newsom, of course, is he is a white dude, and he is more susceptible to intersectionality complaints and complaints from the woke left. And people will remember what he was like as mayor of San Francisco, and they'll remember what he was like when he was in the Brown administration. They'll remember those things. But if Donald Trump allows Gavin Newsom to be the face of the resistance, then he can maybe, and this is a big maybe, this is a big if, maybe Gavin Newsom can both be the moderating Democrat. Maybe he can have his cake and eat it too. If Donald Trump sets Newsom up to be the hero of the resistance, then maybe he can also be the hero of the resistance and moderate his positions on these issues without getting absolutely AOC'd in a Democratic primary.
So you're saying Newsom at heart started out as more of a moderate, and then only went along with the prevailing winds in recent years to become more liberal, and now is tacking back towards his true centrist self. It's interesting. I don't know that a lot of Americans remember all of that and know all that, but it is also interesting in the shorter term to think of him, as you mentioned, kind of throwing his hat into the ring for the upcoming presidential election by very obviously tacking to the center and starting his podcast and hosting Steve Bannon and Charlie Kirk. And I thought that was going pretty well as a repositioning or as attacking back to where he came from until this LA riot thing, which puts him back on the side of the lefties, no?
Well, much like when we talk about Iran, what happens now, right? The unrest in Los Angeles has not been like the Rodney King riots or the LA has known much worse public violence in the past 60 years than these. And we don't know. We have protests popping up all over the country, and we have ICE going hard, right? Is this the beginning of a longer arc in which we see U.S. forces, Donald Trump? So a court reversed Donald Trump's authority, or said that he did not have the authority to nationalize the California Guard. An appeals court has allowed Trump's order nationalizing the National Guard to stay in place while the appeal works its way through. But I don't know. There's a story you can tell in which in red states, governors are mobilizing the National Guard and they're clashing with protesters. In blue states, Trump is allowed to mobilize the National Guard or some posse comitatus. There's some workaround using the Alien Enemies Act or whatever that they find out. And we see a summer of armed clashes between federal or federalized troops and protesters with Molotov cocktails and rocks and all of that stuff in a bunch of American cities. I don't think that's the most likely scenario, but if that is the scenario, I guess I would say Republicans have a shared memory, even for those who were born long after, that 1968 and the unrest in the streets of the United States was what won Richard Nixon his decisive win in the 1968 election. And there is certainly truth to that. But I will also say Americans were uncomfortable with Kent State. So how much will Republicans get credit for conflict with rioters? Lots, right? If Gavin Newsom finds himself as the spokesman for a wild effort that is unsettling America's cities, this is not good for Gavin Newsom.
And that can go sideways very easily, right? Politically, because I mean, the very nature of riots, the very nature of the unpredictability of what's happening on the ground,
in 2020, when we think about the ways that Donald Trump lost the election, right? How do we score the rioting of 2020 in that election? Donald Trump would say, I assume, that because Tim Walz and other governors wouldn't take strenuous enough action against the rioting, that it redounded to Trump's disadvantage. If maybe a good way to always think about, not always, but a good way to think about the Trump second term is that he's trying to undo the things that happened in the first term. He's undoing those things. And one of the things that I think he wants to undo is that the military resisted him and governors resisted him during the George Floyd riots and the protests and the subsequent riots. And he was thwarted in those efforts. I think this time the idea is we're going to impose order. We're going to impose order even if it provokes riots. We're going to smash the face of the Antifa left and the Soros backed the villains that Trump sees out in these cities. And I think they mean to do it, right? Whether the courts allow them to do it, how people respond, what goes on. But I would say this is a real live one. This is a real live one. And Gavin Newsom has a lot of fat in the fire, but so do Republicans.
Yep. You know, Chris, tomorrow something unusual is going to happen here in the city of Washington, and that is there's going to be a military parade. Ostensibly, this is to commemorate the 250th birthday of the U.S. Army. It also happens to be the 79th birthday of Donald Trump. You write in today's edition of Whole Hog Politics, you worry about the use of the military for political purposes, the politicization of the U.S. military, and you talk about a speech that the president gave, a very political speech the president gave at Fort Bragg in front of soldiers. This week, you talk about how the soldiers who appeared at that speech were screened for their politics. Let's talk first about the parade. You know, what's to say this isn't just a patriotic celebration of the Army's birthday?
Well, certainly if it was a parade that was happening in Fort Hood, or if it or whatever, I cannot keep up with the partisan naming and renaming of America's military bases. But if this were taking place at Fort Bragg, yeah, that would be it would be an uncontroversial question, even if it were in another city. The rolling tanks down Constitution Avenue is it's a vibe, I think, as the youth would say. It's different. This is very different. And 250 years is a good. It's a big occasion, older than the country itself. Thanks, Army. But it's weird. And when you put it in context with the other stuff that's going on, like the stuff that we talked about, and as you mentioned, the speech where Donald Trump is attacking his political opponents to the cheers of uniformed troops around him, I guess I would say, if you're a Republican, you have to spend a lot of time defending stuff that Donald Trump does. They knew it when he won the nomination. They knew that this is the story. And for many, they can do it enthusiastically because they just say, I trust the guy, whatever he says, whatever he does is fine. For the rest of them, and I think you saw some of this in Pete Hegseth's Senate testimony this week, where Republicans, well, both in the House and Senate, are like, bro, what are you doing? And for Republicans who want to defend Trump on as much as they can, right? You can take the military parade and you can say, look, I know it's on his birthday, and I know that this is something that he wanted to do the first time around but couldn't do it. And I know it's going to be expensive, and I know it's weird, but it's the Army's 250th birthday. Let's not overreact to this. And you can do that. And then you turn the page and you say, what about sending the Marines into Los Angeles? Where are you on that? Well, taken alone, you can explain how George H.W. Bush during the LA riots of 1993 also mobilized some Marines to go into that space. By the way, under pressure from Pat Buchanan. George H.W. Bush, or 92, George H.W. Bush under pressure from Pat Buchanan for looking like a wimp because LA was burning. That was part of how George H.W. Bush ended up holding on to the nomination and doing all that stuff. But you can come up with the contextualized case. Okay, here's how you could send 600 troops. Nationalize the National Guard. Well, you could go back to the 1960s and you can say this is why you have to do it sometimes, these things, so on and so forth. You can do each of them individually. But the problem is that when taken as a whole,
you see a pattern.
The pattern's there. And the military, Joe Biden, when he renamed the bases, I want to be temperate in my words, but it was an idiotic thing to do. Nobody knows who Braxton Bragg is, right?
Braxton Bragg. And then Trump just changed him back, and then the next Democrat is going to change him. It's become now yet another political football.
So when we look at the story of the United States in the past 75 years, it's a story about declining confidence in institutions. Down, 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 down.
Except the military.
except the military. The military, which is this great conveyor into the middle class and beyond for Americans from poverty-stricken communities. The military, which is the true meritocracy, right? The place where it doesn't matter who you are, it's can you do the work. The fact that 80% of Americans in a Pew Research poll said that they had confidence in the military to do the right thing almost all of the time. That we have one institution left. What is the thing that sets it apart from those other institutions? It works so hard to be not political. It works so hard. The military bends over backwards to avoid the appearance of politicization. And for a long time, we could count on people in our government, politicians, to have to ultimately respect some of those barriers. You were covering George W. Bush when we had mission accomplished hanging from the con tower on an aircraft carrier. And the White House said, no, we did not hang the tower. We did not hang that. We didn't do it. They hung the banner. It was for the sailors. It wasn't for us. That's how careful politicians used to have to be about these kinds of things. And now, whether it's the political renaming, and now Trump, as I told the story of the ladder at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that hasn't been moved for longer than the U.S. Army has existed. And they never move it because they don't want to trigger the conflict with the other sects. Joe Biden is like, I'm going to move the ladder. What do you think if I just move the ladder over here a little bit? Donald Trump is like, what if I pick the ladder up and smash the window out with the ladder? What are you going to do then? And that's not good for the military, certainly. It's not good for the country. Those stories don't end well when you have one institution and it's the military. That's what they have in Turkey. That's what they had in Brazil. You don't want the military to be the only institution that retains the credibility of the people. So I guess it's a long way of saying politicians should act better.
And as you wrote in your Whole Hog newsletter this morning, one of the reasons to keep politics out of the military is that we ask our military to do some very tough things and go into some very difficult places. Chris, we're running out of time, but I know that you've got your show. In addition to writing Whole Hog newsletter for The Hill, you host The Hill Sunday for News Nation. What do you have coming up for this Sunday show, Chris?
The sounds you hear behind me are the people ripping up copies of rundowns. We have one person that I'm very excited to talk to is Corey Shockey, who is a defense expert who's going to help us untangle this, both the stuff overseas and the stuff at home. But we have a Democrat, we have a Republican, we have all of the constituent parts. But you'll have to tune in to see where we land in order to try to cover another astonishing week of news in Washington, D.C.
That's all the time we have for Whole Hog Politics. See you next time. I'm Bill Salmon with Chris Stirewalt, Whole Hog Politics.